Every phone you've ever owned has a tiny brain inside it, and that brain comes in more flavors than most people realize. Let's go through the major players. Qualcomm Snapdragon. If you've bought an Android phone in the US, there's a good chance it's running a Snapdragon chip. Qualcomm makes these, and they're basically the default choice for flagship and mid-range Android devices from Samsung, OnePlus, Motorola, and a dozen other brands. What makes Snapdragon so dominant isn't just raw speed, it's the modem. Qualcomm has spent decades perfecting cellular connectivity, so their chips tend to have some of the best 5G performance around. The flagship line, the Snapdragon 8 series, shows up in phones that cost $800 and up, while the 6 and 7 series power the more affordable stuff. One quirk worth knowing, Samsung sometimes uses Snapdragon in the US and their own chip elsewhere, which is why two people with the same Galaxy phone can have noticeably different performance. Qualcomm has also been pushing into laptops recently with its Snapdragon X series, trying to challenge Intel and Apple on battery life. So this isn't just a phone story anymore. It's slowly becoming a bigger piece of the whole computing world. Apple A series and Bionic. Apple doesn't buy processors off the shelf, they design their own, and that's a huge part of why iPhones feel so snappy, even with less RAM than competing Android phones. The A series, which Apple branded as Bionic for years before dropping that name, is built using ARM architecture, but customized so heavily that it barely resembles anything else on the market. The advantage here is tight integration. Apple controls the chip, the operating system, and the software all at once, so they can optimize in ways that a company buying a generic chip simply can't. This is also why an iPhone from 3 years ago can still run the newest iOS updates smoothly, while an Android phone of the same age might struggle. It's the same reasoning behind Apple's move to bring these chips into Macs. The M-series processors in MacBooks are basically bigger, more powerful cousins of the same design philosophy that started in the iPhone. Samsung Exynos. Samsung doesn't just use Qualcomm's chips, they make their own too, called Exynos. These show up in Galaxy phones sold in Europe, parts of Asia, and other regions outside North America. For years, Exynos had a reputation problem, running hotter and draining battery faster than the Snapdragon equivalent in the exact same phone model. Samsung has worked hard to close that gap, partnering with AMD to bring proper gaming-grade graphics into recent Exynos chips. MediaTek Dimensity and Helio. MediaTek used to be the budget option, the chip you'd find in phones that cost $150 and nobody talked about. That's changed a lot. Their Dimensity line now competes directly with Snapdragon in the mid-range and even flagship space, particularly in phones sold across Asia and by brands like Xiaomi, Realme, and Oppo. The older Helio series still exists for genuinely budget devices. What's interesting about MediaTek's rise is that it's forced Qualcomm to actually compete on price, which has been good news for anyone shopping for a phone that doesn't cost a fortune. A few years ago, saying a phone had a MediaTek chip was almost a red flag among tech reviewers. Now it's common to see a Dimensity chip outperform a similarly priced Snapdragon in independent benchmarks, so that old stigma is fading fast. Google Tensor. Google's Pixel phones run on a chip called Tensor, and it's a slightly different animal from the rest of this list. Tensor isn't really designed to win benchmark tests or crush every speed comparison. It's built around machine learning tasks, things like real-time call translation, photo processing, and voice recognition running directly on the device instead of in the cloud. Under the hood, Tensor is actually built with a lot of help from Samsung's manufacturing and even borrows some Exynos components. But Google layers its own AI-focused cores on top. If you've ever used a Pixel's ability to transcribe a call as it happens, that's Tensor doing the heavy lifting. HiSilicon Kirin. Kirin chips are made by HiSilicon, which is owned by Huawei, and for a while these were genuinely competitive with Snapdragon and Apple's chips, especially in camera processing. Then US trade restrictions cut Huawei off from the manufacturing technology needed to produce cutting-edge chips, and Kirin's development stalled hard for several years. Huawei has since found workarounds using domestic Chinese manufacturing, though the chips still lag a generation or two behind the industry's best. It's a good example of how geopolitics can reshape something as seemingly unrelated as phone hardware. And it's also why Huawei phones essentially disappeared from Western markets, even though the company still sells enormous volumes back home in China. Unisoc. Unisoc is the name you've probably never heard, and that's kind of the point. This Chinese manufacturer makes budget processors that show up in some of the cheapest smartphones sold worldwide, often priced under $100. They're not built for gaming or heavy multitasking. They're built to make basic smartphone functionality accessible in markets where every dollar of the bill of materials matters. Custom ARM designs. Almost everything on this list, aside from a few exceptions, is built on ARM architecture rather than the x86 design you'd find in a typical Windows laptop. ARM licenses its chip blueprints out to companies who then customize them to their own needs. That's why a Snapdragon chip and an Apple chip can both technically be ARM-based while performing completely differently. The companies are making very different design choices with the same underlying foundation. That's the landscape of smartphone processors as it stands today. If you found this useful, give TechXplainer a like and subscribe for more.